Thank you for coming to this seminar in our News and Media Research Seminar Series. It's lovely to see you all here today. Today we have two presenters. We have Dr. Jee Young Lee and Dr. Susan Atkinson, who are presenting their work on social media in a crisis, Facebook as an official communication tool in a crisis. So you have shared your screen, and so I will hand it over to the speakers.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and I'd like to also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people on whose land I live and work and where the University of Canberra is located. And thank you, Kerry, for the introduction. So yes, Jee and I are both researchers in the News and Media Research Centre here at the University of Canberra. And today we're going to be talking about our content analysis study, Social Media in a Crisis, which focused on Facebook as an official communication tool during the bushfire. Now my slide is changing, good. So just a little bit about the context for the research, and my own experience has really led me to look at this. So I'm Canberra born and bred, and I lived through the 2003 bushfires. I was living on the edge of Canberra, watching the flames come across the paddocks near Hall, and also hosing embers off my parents' roof in Campbell. So during the 2019-20 season that started very early, so in August, September 2019, we were sitting at home on our iPads looking for information about the fires, the weather forecast, the wind speed, the road closures, and smoke health warnings. So we were accessing websites and apps in the ACT and in surrounding New South Wales, and the information was patchy and inconsistent across sources. It was hard to tell which information was the most recent or the most accurate, and I'm pretty sure I wasn't the only person thinking that at the time. So the 2019-20 bushfire season was one of widespread devastation. 12.6 million hectares of Australia burned, including 2 million hectares across New South Wales before we'd even reached Christmas. And Canberra was surrounded by bushfires in New South Wales. Poor air quality had become an issue for many areas, including Canberra and the ACT. So the daily news broadcast focused on the negative issues of risk and threat to life and property. Television and radio, primarily the ABC, encouraged people to follow the ACT Emergency Services Agency, so the ACT ESA, through the website and social media channels to stay up to date. So in a natural disaster like a bushfire, people need to be able to quickly access information to make sometimes life and death decisions. They want clear and unambiguous information from trusted sources about risk and safety. The final report from the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements, which was tabled in Parliament in October, noted that there are confusing and unnecessary inconsistencies in some of the information provided to the public, and that government should educate people and provide accessible information to help them make informed decisions and take appropriate action. So the findings in the report highlighted the need for improved communication with the public, including timely and accurate warnings, and this echoed recommendations from lots of previous reviews. So in Australia, the trusted organisations and sources of information in a bushfire context are government agencies such as emergency services organisations, rural fire services, and the ABC. While news media remains the most important source of information during crises, government agencies are significant contributors as the most trusted and critical source of that information. Previous studies with a focus on organisational crisis communication suggest that community resilience in preparedness for a bushfire event is enhanced by deep and sustained engagement and communication with communities prior to, during, and after the event. So community engagement coupled with mass communication techniques encourages better collective preparedness. This can help individuals build trust and confidence in the organisations that are responsible for providing information, and consequently promote collective action and better outcomes. The digital platforms have become valuable resources, allowing immediate access to quality information and news. And this is particularly essential in a crisis with citizens thirsty for credible, fast news and information. Social media has become increasingly popular as a source of information and news, It's a critical component of crisis communication as it creates opportunities for immediate transmission of important crisis information to the public and keeping communities informed. The research highlights the need for organisations to pre-establish a strong social media presence on multiple platforms before the crisis to optimise communication during the crisis. Frequent, consistent and interactive communication with users where the conversation is already taking place plays a significant role in building trust. People go to the source of information they trust in times of crisis and are increasingly searching for current and local information using social media channels. Many scholars also emphasise the contribution of research to evaluation, particularly the use of social media, and how research can develop evidence-based recommendations to improve communication practice. Social media is only going to become more and more important, and authorities will benefit from understanding and applying its affordances. So the purpose of this study was to explore how the key agencies managed their social media communication during the Aurora Valley Clear Range bushfire event. So in the ACT, we knew the fire as the Aurora Valley Fire, and the name Clear Range Fire was given to the fire by the New South Wales Rural Fire Service when it crossed the state border into New South Wales. The key emergency services authorities examined in the study are the ACT Emergency Services Agency, the ACT ESA, and the New South Wales Rural Fire Service. These are the trusted organisations in the context of bushfires. Other organisations are the local ABC radio and television channels. I initially also included the ACT Rural Fire Service, but quickly discovered that it only reposted some of the information from the ACT ESA and pointed people to that website as the source of truth anyway. So the data was collected from the official Facebook pages of the agencies and included all the original posts made by the agencies with the purpose of communicating information to the community. Both the ACT ESA and the New South Wales RFS include the use of social media channels in their operational and strategic communication plans. So the aim of the research was to investigate how the key emergency service authorities used Facebook to communicate with affected communities about the Aurora Valley Clear Range bushfire. The sub-research question was, to what extent did these authorities' use of social media demonstrate characteristics of effective risk and crisis communication? So this study used content analysis in a mixed method approach to explore how the two agencies managed their social media communication during the Aurora Valley bushfire. The data collected comprised unique Facebook posts from the official ACT ESA and New South Wales RFS Facebook pages between 20th of January and 5th of March 2020. The Aurora Valley fire started on the 27th of January and was declared extinguished on the 27th of February. The peak fire days were from 27th of January to the 10th of February when the fire was declared contained. So the total number of posts was 613, 397 from the ACT ESA page and 216 from the New South Wales RFS page. We conducted statistical analyses including crosstab, t-test, ANOVA and SPSS to examine the statistical significance of the differences. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the framework that we used and how we adapted it to do the content analysis and evaluation. Steelman and McCaffrey developed a framework that brought together best practice and theoretical literature from risk and crisis communication to derive key characteristics associated with best communication practices. Their framework highlights that effective communication is often identified as a key practice to move toward the desired goal, which is more disaster resilient communities. And the four characteristics that we used were: 1, engage in interactive processes or dialogue; 2, strive to understand the social context in which the threat is situated; 3, provide honest, timely, accurate and reliable information; and 4, work with credible sources, including authority figures when appropriate. We adopted this framework to evaluate the communications of the two agencies. So we defined the units of measurement to demonstrate the characteristics and divided these into qualitative and quantitative measures. So first, the posts were categorised by type of content: text, video, images, banners, and attributes of content: tone and style, length, number, frequency, and accessibility. These were used to analyse the agency's understanding of the social context and information provision. So the affordances of Facebook measures, including followers, shares, likes, comments, and template content, was used to analyse interaction with the community. In addition, the number and frequency of posts related to forums and campaigns were measured. Secondly, posts were qualitatively analysed to draw out the similarities and differences in approaches of the agencies in engaging communities and increasing the credibility of the sources. So we examined what types of communication methods determined user engagement and interaction, and how that messaging demonstrated the characteristics of effective crisis communication using statistical testing. I'm just going to talk about each characteristic separately. I'm going to talk about the qualitative measure, then Jee will talk about the quantitative measures. So the first characteristic is engage in interactive processes or dialogue to understand risk perspectives and how they might be addressed. So to examine the engagement in interactive processes of the two agencies, we compared the engagement statistics, shares, likes, and comments, and looked for opportunities for people to seek further information and clarification, including response posts in response to community questions, promotion of community forums, and door-knocking campaigns. So the three qualitative measures we used were the live streamed press conferences, response posts, and then community forums and door-knocking campaigns. So both the ACT ESA and New South Wales RFS are active on Facebook throughout the year, which demonstrates the willingness to go where their audiences are. ACT ESA Facebook followers number over 25% of the population of the ACT, and New South Wales RFS around 10% of the population of New South Wales. It's evident from the data that both agencies use Facebook as a channel for providing information. However, there is little evidence to demonstrate a deeper level of engagement. While official plans for both agencies specifically list social media platforms as appropriate channels for broadcasting warnings and messages, neither agency prescribes two-way engagement or collaboration with communities using social media. During the peak fire period, the ACT ESA live streamed 26 media conferences, which averaged 50,000 views per video. One media conference the day after the fire started had 102,000 viewers. During the same period, New South Wales RFS live streamed only one media conference. This does not mean that they did not have media conferences during this period. They did, just that they were not streamed live on Facebook. So the data highlights a high level of community interest in the information provided by the two agencies and the desire to engage with the content. Only the ACT ESA used Facebook to provide responses to community questions and to promote community forums and door-knocking campaigns. And this in no way implies that the agencies do not undertake collaborative activities through other means and channels, just that Facebook is not being used to do this. Now I'm going to ask Jee to talk about the quantitative measures.
Thanks, Sue. So as Sue mentioned earlier, so we first counted the number of followers, shares, likes, and comments of the two Facebook pages. So ACT ESA page has around 102,000 followers, and NSW RFS has around 748,000 followers, more than 7 times as many followers as ACT Facebook page. However, when we compare the proportion against the population of the two regions, ACT page followers are over 25% of the population of the ACT, NSW around 10% of the population of NSW. These estimates are indicative only as many ACT residents also follow the NSW RFS page, and the residents of NSW who live in areas surrounding the ACT also follow the ACT ESA page. In terms of user engagement measures, the figures here are the total amount of shares, likes, and comments of the posts collected during the peak fire period. Considerably higher number of likes were found in NSW than ACT, whereas it is the opposite when it comes to the number of comments. So the number of comments of ACT ESA is almost twice the number of comments of NSW RFS. This was also observed during the qualitative analysis. The ACT had a higher number of comments because people were tagging other people to share the information, whereas NSW readers were not doing that as much. In terms of sharing, NSW has a higher number of shares than that of ACT-SA, but the difference does not appear that significant compared to the number of likes and comments. So user engagement. In order to examine the differences in the three engagement measures, we conducted a t-test. The results show that NSW post has a higher engagement levels than ACT, as you can see. On average, 2,656 likes were observed in the NSW RFS page, which is not surprising given that the number of followers compared to ACT-SA followers. Posts on NSW were also significantly more likely to be shared, with an average 507 shares compared to 148 shares. On average, NSW RFS posts had 188 comments, whereas 119 comments for the case of ACT-ESA posts.
Okay, so the second characteristic that we measured was strive to understand the social context so that message and content can fit the appropriate circumstance. So to assess the extent to which each agency demonstrated this characteristic, we compared the types and attributes of content, the use of visual content, whether the posts include location or region-specific information, and applied the National Bushfire Warning System. The results show there are striking differences in the social media communication approach between the two agencies. Both agencies tailored messages to localised audience to some extent through titles of their posts, specific content within the posts, and locality descriptors within the coloured banners. In line with the nationally consistent bushfire warning system, both agencies consistently used coloured banners to highlight the current warning level. The use of the coloured banners allows readers to see the warning level at a glance and to see which local area it referred to. And this is consistent with good visual communication in that it is concise, understandable, and actionable. In addition to their central Facebook pages, the New South Wales RFS has local RFS hubs where people can obtain specific details for fires burning in their area. While this decentralised approach is appropriate due to the size of New South Wales, and on any given day there were as many as 60+ fires burning around the state, it does assume that people know where else to go for information relevant to them. Posts on the central New South Wales RFS Facebook page use the allocated name of the fire and identify the relevant local government area. This is helpful in highlighting the particular location of the fire, but unless accompanied by a map and or links to other pages, provides little useful information.
And so in order to examine the extent to which each agency demonstrated different features in the public communication practice, we compared the post type and length. So here the figures show the difference in the post type used between the two agencies. ACT page included more text-only posts, and the second category, text with banners, than NSW, whereas NSW included a lot more posts in a hybrid form comprising of text, infographics, photos, and maps. ACT included more image-based posts than NSW. So the next slide, there was also a striking difference in the length of content. Posts on NSW page were predominantly short with 84%, whereas only 45% of the posts on ACT page were in the short category. On the other hand, ACT consisted of posts in the long category with 29% compared to only 0.5% for NSW RFS page. So here are some examples showing the differences in the type of posts observed in the two agencies' Facebook pages. On the left side, the ACT-SA post is very long and text-dense without headings, and the warning system colored banner is way down on the bottom of the post. Whereas on the right side, the NSW RFS post included condensed text with the warning banners right next to a map. So it appears that an ACT ESA was especially careful, providing more detail rather than less, whereas NSW RFS posts were more likely to be short with critical messages and images.
So the third characteristic is to provide honest, timely, accurate and reliable information. And in order to gauge how well the agencies meet this criterion, we considered the types and attributes of content and number and frequency of posts. So both agencies provided regular updates on their Facebook pages about what was going on in the various fire grounds, and observing the requirements of the National Warning System provided predictable updates depending on the level of warning. Both agencies provided different levels of details in their posts, but were consistent in the provision of that information on a predictable basis. So for the qualitative measure, we looked at the key messages within the media conferences. So through the use of live streamed media conferences, both agencies demonstrated a high level of compassion and empathy. The ACT ESA used these conferences to good effect, streaming them live on Facebook, as they gave people the chance to see the crisis leaders as human and to build credibility with the community and trust that they were in control. Both agencies took every opportunity to call out the great work of firefighters, other agencies and organisations through posts about awards, sacrifices, acts of generosity and gratitude. Many of the comments from the public were expressing praise and thanks to the agency staff and firefighters. The media conferences were successfully used as platforms to present messaging around the unpredictable nature of bushfires, and that successfully fighting the fires was dependent on many factors, such as wind, humidity, temperature, and terrain. Being honest about what is known and not known, avoiding speculation and presenting risk messages with honest and communicating the full potential scope of the crisis helps build trust and credibility. The media conferences allowed for ongoing messaging, encouraging people to be prepared and to monitor what is going on, which contributes to people feeling in control and able to respond.
So we compared the types of information shared on the page. So we coded posts into 3 categories: community-related information, non-fire-related information, and specific fire ground advice and direction. Community-related information and non-fire-related information was significantly more observed on the ACT page, whereas NSW included predominantly specific fire ground advice and direction. We also observed that there were a considerable number of comments seeking clarification of information posted and asking questions about specific services and advice on the ACT Facebook page, which may reflect the limited engagement with the specific services and advice in the ACT ESA communication practice.
Characteristic 4 was work with credible sources who have legitimacy, including authority figures where appropriate. People are more likely to believe and act on messages from people that they trust. And in a bushfire crisis, they seek information from the organisations and people they believe will provide the information they need and that it will be accurate and reliable. The status of the message deliverer is important, and the higher level of credibility with the public, the greater the trust in the information. So this specific criterion was evaluated based on qualitative analysis of the media conferences streamed by both agencies and the visibility and credibility of their leaders and spokespersons. So both New South Wales RFS and ACT ESA had leaders with a high personal level of trust and credibility within the community. So Commissioner Shane Fitzsimmons and Commissioner Georgina Whelan. These individuals were front and centre for their agencies during the fire season and were often flanked by other senior members of their organisation and highly credible sources from other organisations during the media conferences.
So we examined engagement, so how users interact with the different types of content in different ways by comparing the engagement levels by the type of content. So here, posts in a hybrid form comprising of text and visual content such as infographics and maps had the highest likes, whereas text-only posts were a lot more likely to be shared. In terms of the number of comments, posts in a hybrid form comprising of text and banners attracted the most comments. And then we also compared to engagement level by the length of posts. So the length of posts was a significant factor in determining the level of user engagement, with the short posts attracting higher number of likes and comments. In terms of sharing, although it appears that the short posts were more likely to be shared, it was not statistically significant. Interestingly, sharing was not determined by the length of post, but the type of information included in the post. Specific fire ground advice and direction related posts were significantly more likely to be shared compared to community information and non-fire related information. Specific fire ground advice and direction related posts had also the most likes. On the other hand, users were more likely to comment on non-fire related information compared to other information. Our further observation confirmed that many of the comments were people tagging others to share information and expressing gratitude for the work of the agencies, staff, and firefighters. So our findings confirmed that the two agencies provided timely, accurate, and reliable information and used credible and trusted sources and spokespeople. Further, that the way they communicated with communities and citizens were different, which resulted in differences in user engagement interaction. The data highlights users interact with different types of content in different ways, which is determined by the types of communication method. This provides some implications for enhancing government understanding about the effective communication through digital communication tools such as social media. We also observed that user engagement through the technology affordances in social media, liking, sharing, and commenting, is crucial to information flow during a crisis. The significance of informal communication through different communication channels, such as social networks, has been increasingly recognized by crisis communication researchers, while the content analysis shows the distinct communication practices and user engagement between the two agencies. It is important to understand how social media facilitates information sharing in a crisis and increases community connectedness. So for further investigation, we initiated a user survey, which is currently underway. The survey is aimed at social media users in the ACT and surrounding areas of the NSW to collect the data around what kind of information people seek, where they go to look for it, and how they make decisions in a crisis. It will investigate the role and impact of user engagement on the information flow of agencies' Facebook pages. This survey study adopted the framework of the characteristics of effective communication, aiming to find underlying factors and structure in the relationship between variables and gather validity evidence for the measurement of the effective communication, which we developed based on the existing framework. Preliminary findings through the factor analysis and reliability tests have indicated that the measure is internally valid and consistent. So we're very excited about it. And so we hope to have an opportunity to share the results of this further research with you in the future.
So there's no doubt that the government is paying more attention to research and applying strong evidence to develop better policies, programs, and operational responses. In addition to the Bushfire Royal Commission last year, in July last year, the Minister for Industry announced funding of $85 million to support the transition of the previous Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre to a new world-class disaster research centre, Natural Hazards Research Australia. And their first blog post a month ago announced the beginning of the establishment phase with the formal launch due later in the year. And it acknowledges the critical role of multidisciplinary science and research in the important discussion around new national research priorities. As the number of social media users grows, the usefulness of text data for research is increasing, and social media has become a useful platform to conduct empirical research about its users. A high-level look at the comments in this study highlights that many of the comments were people tagging others to share information, and expressing gratitude for the work of the agency's staff and firefighters. In addition, there are a considerable number of comments seeking clarification of information posted and asking questions about specific services and advice. So the plan now is to do a more comprehensive analysis of the detail of the comments to get a better understanding of what information people find useful in a crisis and when and how they use it to make critical decisions. A comprehensive analysis of the words, statements, and questions in the comments would yield a deeper understanding of what information people find useful, and combined with further user-centered research to design and test effective communication methods, would provide evidence for organisations to inform future strategic communication planning. So before finishing off, I'd just like to share the links to our survey and project page. People want to fill in the survey, that would be great. Or if they want to share it with their networks, that would be even better. And that is the end of our presentation. So thank you everybody very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Sue and Jee, for that fascinating presentation. My apologies for my poorly timed coughing fit earlier. I think I'm okay now. So we'll pass it over to Q&A. We've got about 25 minutes and we've got a lot of people online joining us, which is fantastic. So feel free to raise your hand or type a question in the chat function.
I think we talk too fast, Jee.
I'll just check that I'm not missing any raised hands.
I think it's showing raised hand.
I can't, well, I don't know why I can't see the raised hands. Can whoever's raised their hands, please feel free to speak.
Oh, hi, thanks, Jee. I'm quite interested in your project, and just have some some questions. I'm just wondering, how about the likes, shares, and comments, the number? Do you use the absolute value, or you standard by like the number of followers for each agency, or like the population in ACT and New South Wales? And yeah.
So the number of posts, likes, and comments, that's the average number of the engagement levels by posts. Yeah, we collected during the period of time.
Yeah, because I think
so that's the absolute number. Yeah,
because the population of the two are quite different, and the number of followers is quite different. So I'm thinking if we can standard it, it might be better. Yeah,
that's, I think, good suggestion. I was actually wondering about the better way to compare, because as you can see, there's a big difference. I mean, in terms of the population of the followers between the two agencies. Yeah.
And how about the location of their followers? So I guess quite big number of the followers should be located in that place, but do you have tried to find out how?
No, we haven't.
Okay, thank you.
But that's a good suggestion. Yeah. I mean, given your experts, I think, it'll be great if you could help us figure out.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question? Well, I might ask a question then, and apologies, Sue and Jee, if you covered this and I missed it. But I'm curious about the dialogic affordances of the social media platforms. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the ways in which some of these emergency services organisations are responding dialogically. Is this something that you formally measured? Did I miss that? Apologies if I did, but were they engaging in this sort of ongoing dialogue with members of the public?
It's a really good question. we did look at it kind of just at a high level, mainly because I haven't had a really good deep look at the comments yet. Both the agencies include social media use as part of their strategic communication plans, but they're really just listed in passing as another channel to transmit the warnings and all those kind of things. They're not described in their communication plans as a channel for engaging with community or anything like that. So during the crisis, so during the 6-week period that we looked at, I didn't see New South Wales Facebook page reply to any comment or question by anyone who posted on their page. The ACT were better in a sense in that they used Facebook to advertise community forums and door-knocking campaigns, and they also posted, they were getting information or questions from other members of the public, and then they would put a post out saying, lots of people have asked us these questions, so here are the answers, kind of thing. So they were responding, probably not in real time, but they were trying to respond to questions that were coming in. There were, does that answer your question? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I guess it sort of raises another question as well about dialogue, not only between members of the public and the Emergency Services Authority, but conversation that might take place between different members of the public through that platform. Because if the ESA, you know, isn't directly responding or in a timely way, do those platforms and pages also provide a forum through which members of the public can respond to each other and a kind of information sharing amongst the public as well? And is that something you might kind of look at in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that is exactly what was happening. Some people were posting questions, and when the organisation didn't reply, other members of the public replied. Like if people were asking which road was this road closed, or where is the closest evacuation centre, other members of the public were jumping on and answering. What was interesting too, and obviously it wasn't part of this study, is that other Facebook groups were being set up by people like, for example, evacuation centres that take pets. So some member of the public had created a Facebook page and then would point other people, if you're interested in this, come to here. So definitely potential for the official Facebook pages to be forums where other people can share information. I guess where it becomes tricky that we haven't looked at is the veracity and validity of the information. If the public is sharing it, then, and it's inaccurate or incorrect, then what happens? But yeah, absolutely another conversation for another day.
So I've got some questions in the chat. So from Jane says, my comment more than a question. For the last 2 weeks in lockdown, my internet is very choosy of what it wants to show me. So no to Outlook and Zoom sometimes, but never with Facebook. Is there any explanation for it?
Interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting, Jane. Thank you for that comment. Matthew, what is the conclusion regarding the difference in focus between the ACT and New South Wales organisations, for example, community info versus other content? And did anything about the results surprise you?
I think that's a really good question. What surprised me is the type of content and the level of engagement. So as I showed, the text-only posts were more likely to be shared compared to other types of posts where other kind of image or banners used. So I believe, the users have a different kind of needs in terms of the communication. So that's why I'm really keen to investigate further using the survey method. Kind of my sense,
I agree. I think it depends on, and I think Jee hit the nail on the head. It depends on what the users go to the site for. I think with the New South Wales RFS page, the intent is not to use it as a place for lots and lots of information, because they have so much information. They were trying to cover so many fires, they could only put little bits up at a time, whereas the ACT, being almost the only source of detailed information, was putting up a lot more detail. In New South Wales, if you wanted more information, you actually had to go somewhere else. So I think that also demonstrates the different kinds of information that people were going there to look for.
So question, perhaps comment from Saffron: does the research really just show that ACT people are more community minded? Joke, but possibly not. I mean, it might tell us something about communities. What do you think, Sue and Jee?
I think our kind of impression, I think the characteristics of the audiences, I think in ACT and New South Wales, are quite different. I can't really prove this, but my impression is, I think in ACT, people are more like, I mean, they're highly educated and, you know, and economically, you know, better off. I think that such characteristic might be related to the reception of the post, and they might likely to demand kind of more, you know, more kind of detailed information, even though the format is not really user friendly.
I think that was one of the things that surprised me with when Jee did all the statistical analysis. The slide that we showed with the ACT page and the New South Wales page, where the ACT page was completely just text from top to bottom, and the New South Wales one had the banner and a map showing the fire, and then 3 key bits of information. The fire's here, this road's closed, get out now. If I was sitting beside the road on my phone looking at Facebook, I'd want the New South Wales one to tell me what I needed to do and stuff. I wouldn't want the ACT one that just was telling me wind speed and wind direction and how many hectares the fire had burnt and all that sort of stuff. But I guess it again goes to the context of where people are accessing the information from. If you're sitting at home on your iPad and you've got the capacity to read a lot of text and look at the information, then it's great. But if you're in a decision-making point where you have to say, do I go or do I stay? It's I don't know, it's not that useful. But that's sort of the next phase of the research. We really want to understand what kind of information people actually go looking for. And then what they actually do with that information, what kind of decisions are they making? And I think that's
and I believe, as Sue mentioned, you know, the needs of information seeking will be different. I mean, for example, those who have, for example, different, you know, information resources. So social media could be kind of additional information resources, whereas some people, for them, social media communication will be the main way to, you know, to get information. Then, you know, so I think it might also result in the digital divide between users, which we are interested for the for the analysis.
So we might go to Prue, who's patiently been waiting with her hand up. Prue.
2 things, I guess. Firstly, just kind of a comment that I think what you said, so about this idea that you know, there's not necessarily that evidence of dialogic communication in that the organisation is responding individually to comments on the pages, but they seem to be listening to kind of overarching concerns and then coming back with information. I think that's a really interesting idea to explore in terms of how that fits into dialogic communication, because I think, you know, we often hear that, you know, social media that enables dialogic communication, organisations should be embracing this, but obviously there's a number of challenges in it, particularly in a crisis situation. If we start responding to every single person, how are we going to resource that kind of thing? So I think that idea of, you know, listening more broadly to concerns and coming back with information that address that is a really interesting and kind of unexplored part of dialogic communication from an organisational perspective.
Yep, I agree. And you're right, in a crisis, it's a bit unreasonable to expect the organisation to be as responsive as you would like them to be, like immediately.
And the other question I just had was, did you take note of any use of emojis? I noticed like that long post example that you used was quite long, but I'm noticing at the moment, particularly ACT Health with the COVID information, are really heavily using emojis to break up their posts and to flag the, you know, the crucial information and things. And I just didn't know if you noticed that or looked at the use of emojis in the posts.
Oh, how cool. No, haven't looked. I haven't looked at all. I have to go back and have a look.
Yeah.
I can't say it stuck with me. I found that ACT, I guess one point with the ACT post, those really long text-based ones, they were cut and paste from their website updates. So they weren't actually tailoring messaging for social media at all. They were just cutting and pasting from their website, which I thought was an interesting thing as well. They didn't have someone doing social media.
Kerry, you've got a question.
Thanks. Thanks, both of you, for a fantastic presentation, and one that I think will lead in lots of interesting directions. I had a question about the hybrid nature of media as one of the people who was actually in isolation in a different sense down on the South Coast. We didn't have access to any digital media. All the mobile phone towers had been taken out. So our reliance was on AM radio. And what I noted at the time was that they were using those updates from the ESA pages in order to communicate that information. So I suppose my questions are just around as we become more reliant on digital communication, and as communicators make more assumptions that people are going to be going to have access to social media, those digital divides, in this case, you know, they were quite dramatic. Those digital divides will become more crucial and more detrimental to those who can't access. So it's possibly just a comment, but if you had some insights into how you think the direction is going.
I think it's a really interesting point. I think too, it just shows how important the ABC radio is. Like in a crisis, it's still the first place that people go to.
Yeah, so I think
radio.
Yeah. And considering that, I think we included the different method of communication in a crisis in our survey to gauge, you know,
where people are going to get the information. I think a key question is, you know, what kind of information are you looking for, and what sources do you use? Like, where do you go to get this? And I guess longer term, we'd like to do some focus groups and interviews and things to really explore, you know, what bits of information are useful and where do people get it from.
Yeah, and among different social media as well. So I can see.
And down the coast, like you were, my parents-in-law were down the coast and we lost contact with them for a few days. And they have, you know, different communities have different ways of dealing with things, but they have a very well-developed community network down there where people were knocking on each other's doors and posting like hard copy notes at the local community centre and stuff, so people could get information about people physically. and they'd set that up before any of the fires and stuff had happened, so people knew where to go. Totally different story about, yeah, nothing to do with social media, but interesting.
I have a comment from David Nolan. Coming back to the direction of Susan's comments, if usage is mediated by context and dependent on situation and what is judged possible effective by a central agency, does that mean best practice assessment is rather moot? Thoughts?
I think I understand your question, David. The framework itself was developed and tested by Stillman and McCaffrey, and they used case study. They tested the methodology and the characteristics and stuff across a range of different bushfire and wildfire crises, and looked at the literature which came up with these characteristics. I know what you mean, but I think there's value still in learning and continually learning about what works in what situations, and if there's things that we can draw out of that to better improve practice, then I think it's worthwhile. But I'd be interested in why don't you come off mute and talk, because I'm not sure if I've understood your question.
He's gone.
David, did you want to add to that, elaborate on that?
Yes, yeah, sorry, I'm just having headphone issues, so I was coming on and off mute. But yeah, so my question was, look, I was just kind of noting the sort of disparity between the assessment framework and then your comments, which were saying, well, the situation in New South Wales was quite different, and, you know, would it have worked really what they were doing in ACT compared to New South Wales? And so then if I'm kind of thinking about your approach as informed by a best practice baseline, it sort of then pulls that kind of context out of the question as a starting point in a way. So I'm just sort of wondering if that's then kind of something that's an implication of your research, is that then requires a kind of next step or a kind of reassessment as something that kind of comes out through the research outcomes. Does that clarify things anymore? I'm not sure.
Not really, in the sense that one of the characteristics is really about striving to understand the social context that it's happening in, so that the messaging and the content is appropriate for the circumstances. So the characteristic that we evaluated was whether the organisation did that and strive to understand the local social context.
Fair enough.
But interesting. I have to think.
We've got another 5 minutes, and I've got a couple of comments here it'd be good to get through. Ronnie Aliff says, have you or will you be checking the timing and accuracy of the social media posts from emergency services and its application and usefulness to people on the ground? And just sort of a note here, I come from Cobargo and directly experience the destruction of my area. And as is being commented at the moment, most communication was cut off for an extended period during our fire crisis in this area.
It's a really good question. We looked, I think one of the things with Facebook as well is the algorithm that decides when feeds are given to people. And there were certainly comments around feeds, older posts being brought up to the top of feeds. And that's something about the algorithm within Facebook that can really confuse people, because people were getting older posts up the top and that kind of thing. I think that's a really good question. I guess Facebook just, as the platform that it is, it wasn't designed to do this in a way that we would like it to work. So for the organisations, it's about being able to understand how that works to try and stop that happening, I guess. That's just one example of Facebook's not designed to do it, but how do we use it better? Or is it something else that we need to be using?
any final questions or comments for Sue and Jee? Sorry, what that W meant.
Tip of the hands there.
Thanks, Kay.
Well, yes, thanks so much, Sue and Jee. That was really interesting and something that is really will continue to be of incredible importance. You know, I was just kind of thinking, you know, I've been watching the press conferences for New South Wales and ACT about COVID, and just thinking about the importance of these social media platforms in these times of crisis, these crises which aren't going away, this sort of rolling set of crises. So really important research, and I think we'll give you all a virtual clap. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks.